You ever feel like you're caught in some kind of cosmic tug of war? Pulled one way by things like love and truth, and the other way by hatred and deception. We all feel these forces playing out, both in the world and, honestly, inside ourselves. So today, we're going to dive into one author's really unique way of looking at all this, and how to flourish, even when things seem, well, pretty dark. Let's get into how he breaks it all down.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with those two forces we all feel, and then we're going to uncover why the author thinks that whole struggle is just a mirage. After that, we'll look at where light and darkness actually come from, how we can align with the light, and finally, why the author believes this moment in time is so incredibly volatile and crucial for all of us.
So first up, let's talk about that constant pull we all experience, pretty much every single day.
I mean, it's a feeling we all get, right? One minute you're feeling so hopeful, inspired by some amazing act of kindness, and the next you're just floored by some story of cruelty or deception. Well, according to the author, this isn't just random noise. He argues it's the fundamental dynamic of our world, playing out right in front of our eyes.
The author kind of frames it like this. Our world is basically a stage where these core energies are always interacting. On one side, you have the forces of light, love, truth, kindness, that stuff that brings us together. And on the other side, the forces of darkness, hatred, deception, cruelty, the things that tear us apart. But here's the twist. What if this whole epic battle isn't what it seems at all?
Yeah, what if that whole struggle isn't actually real? This is where the author drops a really counterintuitive idea, that the entire battle we think we're seeing is just an illusion.
And here it is, the core claim from the author Mark Macy. He's essentially arguing that we've been tricked by a mirage. We've bought into this idea that there are two opposing powers fighting for control, but according to him, that entire premise is just false.
So the key is this. The author suggests there is only one true power. He calls it a spiritual light, or a life energy, and it all flows from one single central source. Everything, what we see as good and what we see as bad, is ultimately connected to this one thing. So, if that's true, where in the world does darkness even come from?
And that brings us perfectly to our third section, the author's fascinating explanation for where both light and, well, what we think of as darkness come from.
Now, to get this, you kind of have to picture the cosmos the way the author does. Imagine reality is layered, or superimposed. Earth is hanging out on one of these levels, but right at the absolute center of it all, that's the source.
And you can really see the difference here. Light is the pure, perfect energy, you can call it God, Allah, Brahman, whatever works for you, that just radiates from that central source. Darkness, though? This is the kicker. It's not a separate evil force fighting back. According to the author, it's nothing more than a shadow. It's just what happens when that perfect light hits Earth and gets deflected by all our human stress and drama and negativity. He literally describes it as a powerless, staticky ball of invisible lint that's just stuck around our planet.
Okay, so if darkness has no real power, if it's just a bunch of staticky lint, how do we step out of its shadow and into the light? Well, this next section gives us a pretty practical path.
The author actually boils it all down to these 4 steps. First, you have to really truly get that the whole light versus dark fight is an illusion. Second, you have to acknowledge that one perfect source at the center of everything. Third, and this is the active part, you consciously devise a life that revolves around that perfection. The author says you can do this with things like meditation or quiet prayer. And then finally, you just act accordingly in your day-to-day life.
Now, I know this all might sound very philosophical, but the author argues that understanding this framework has never been more urgent. He's convinced we're living in a uniquely volatile and crucial time in human history.
And his sense of urgency comes from a pretty specific place, a message he says he received back in the 90s from what he calls 7 cosmic beings. And that message basically said that the light and the shadow are now being forced to unite. From his perspective, all the chaos we see in the world, it's just the first symptom of a great cosmic coming together.
So what are these symptoms he's talking about? Well, the author says to just look around us. Environmental breakdown, endless wars and famine, growing social unrest, moral decay, and just so much widespread suffering. He sees all of this as proof that some kind of cosmic sorting out process is already happening.
And, it's interesting to note, as the author does, that this whole idea of a great end time, this period of judgment and massive transformation, it's not totally new.
You see versions of it pop up in many of the world's major religions, from the Christian Last Judgment and the Islamic Day of Judgment to the end of the Kali Yuga in Hinduism.
So really, it all boils down to this. The author is basically presenting humanity with a choice. We can either wake up, recognize what's happening, and consciously choose to clean up our own mess, that collective shadow we've all created. Or, if we don't, and things get too out of hand, he believes that cosmic forces might just step in and do a general house cleaning for us.
And that leaves us right here, with the final, really provocative question that the author's work puts to us. In this time of growing global drama, he argues the only way forward is to choose the light, to let go of the mirage of a great battle, and instead acknowledge our deep oneness with that eternal, perfect source. The choice, he says, is ours. So, what will it be?